Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the story of you. This is all about learning about the beginning, the middle, and the end of each of my interviewees. Today's story is all about Natalia Flynn. She's a yoga instructor, teacher, and coach. Welcome, Natalia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to partake and be part of this new project for you. I'm so excited.
Thank you so much. Now, I'd really love it if you could explain everybody who you are at this moment in time.
Well, I have come to embrace being a lifelong student. You know, that life has been lesson after lesson after lesson, and it continues to be that. And even the process of making choices are lessons for me as well, because making choices takes confidence, discernment, and a certain level of intuition and belief in oneself. And all of those qualities have been quite hard won for me in my life. So I'm a lifelong student, and I hope to continue learning as I go along.
That's great to hear. So what are you doing as work for right now? You are a yoga instructor, if I recall.
Yes. I am a certified yoga teacher and meditation coach. My yoga journey started many years ago, actually, about 17 or so years ago. My first foray into the yoga experience was actually quite funny. I was living in New York City at the time, and I was working in radio, and I was the news desk editor for a drive time show. So it was the morning drive time. So I had to be at the station quite early. And so when you're up at 4 a.m. and, trying to wake up and sipping your coffee and, zapping through the channels, and there's not much on at that point yet, right? And so one morning I was just sort of flipping through the channels, and I landed on, I don't even remember what channel it was, but I landed on a channel that was featuring a yoga practice early in the morning, like a very, very early morning practice. And I was enthralled. I was like, oh, wow, is this yoga? Like I had an understanding sort of conceptually about what it was and whatnot. And, we all have these, sort of these images and perceptions and things like that. But I actually had never seen an actual practice unfold in front of my eyes. So I started watching, and, they seemed to be having a really, really good time. Like people were really, they were smiling and enjoying themselves and moving really, really gracefully and wonderfully. And I thought, wow, if this is yoga, this is kind of cool. Let me give this a try. So, I headed off to work that day, etc. And then the next morning I put a towel down on the floor in front of the TV to try and follow along, which I did for a brief period of time, and then I started looking for some studio classes in the city, and then it just kind of evolved from there, and it became a very a very regular personal practice for myself. I would, it was a sanctuary for me in a lot of ways, and from the stresses and all of that of life. But the interesting thing about that is that it didn't. I didn't land on the idea of teaching yoga until much, much later. And so, the journey actually began really when you and I were both working at Army Public Affairs, right? So that really was a bit of a turning, those years were a bit of a turning point in my life, because I had shuttled away from national defense for a number of years to work at a different department, and then I shuttled back. Somehow it just always brought me back to DAPA, Army Director at Army Public Affairs. It always brought me back there. And, and just sort of the wonderful experience of working with, with all of those people on the team. It was just so inspiring. And I had always had an affinity and just sort of an interest and a love and appreciation for the military community. I'd always had tremendous respect for them. And as I started, working with, with military people again, and also getting interested in studying trauma, I stumbled upon some books written by Dr. John Whalen, whom I consider a mentor of sorts, and he's been very, very graciously, we've for a period of time, we had sort of one of those academic kind of conversations, back and forth, where I would ask him some questions about his research, and we would communicate back and forth. And I read through all of his books, and so that immersed me into the topic of trauma. And not only did it sort of open my eyes to what a lot of people who are military serving and veterans and first responders, and people in very high stakes and very high stress environments often face a lot of struggles, and and are exposed to some really distressing experiences and things like that. So with that, I was able to learn a lot more about post-traumatic stress and all of those experiences. And the twofold piece here is, not only did I learn about that in a very sort of in its broad concept, but I also became more and more aware of my own traumatic experiences in my life. And because up until that point, I had been living in what I have now come to realize is a profoundly dissociative state. And where
So let's talk a bit about that,
mm-hmm.
Because this is the story of you and how you got to this point.
Yeah.
So let's start from an early age. What are some of the first memories that you have?
That's a really, really interesting question, because I actually don't have a lot of memories of my childhood, of my kidhood. I don't remember too much, really, but I do remember one thing that was something that I really enjoyed doing when I was a little kid. We lived in Toronto, and in Mississauga specifically. And I remember when I was about 4 or 5 or whatnot, was when the first time we went to one of the large sort of greenhouse spaces in Centennial Park. And there was one area that featured sort of very arid plants, like cacti and succulents and things like that, and the whole entire ground space in there was tiny pebbles. And for any little kid, collecting rocks and whatnot is is like hitting the jackpot. So I remember enjoying going to that greenhouse, and collecting all sorts of colored rocks and things like that. So I do remember that. Yeah. So there were some moments. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like it was a very impactful memory of of that moment.
Mm-hmm.
In the lack of memories, let's go chronological. So, where did you live growing up?
Well, I was born in downtown Toronto at St. Joe's Medical Center. Then we lived in Mississauga for the first 10 years of my life. And then we moved to Germany. And I know one of the first questions that I always get, oh, are you a military family? No, actually not. It was as simple as my father had long had an interest in Germany. He was, quite interested in it culturally and from an economic perspective and things like that. And it was as simple as he got a job with a German company. And so we packed up and moved. It sounds so simple, but yet it was actually, all that glitters is not gold, right? So just mm, the thing that was a bit of a struggle was that just the way that the whole move was gone about was very emblematic of a lot of the family dynamic that is present in my family. And so children were kind of more to be seen and not heard, right? So neither myself nor my brother were really prepared and really understood what was happening. And and moving to a place where you didn't know where you were. And because I had just turned 10 years old at that time. And it's one thing where conceptually you may understand, oh, okay, we're moving, but you really don't fully understand what's happening until you're actually in the throes. And then there were a lot of really jarring moments in terms of the immersion of being there. And my
So let's talk
parents.
about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, did you have a social structure that was there that you could depend upon, or
No, it
was
was
that absent?
that was very absent. It was profoundly isolating and very lonely to be there because, most European countries are culturally quite homogeneous, and they, even, possibly I would think it's not even malicious, but they are so very aware of self and other in terms of like, this is us and you are other. And so basically, you're in a country where you don't speak the language. Neither of us spoke the language. My dad had a very cursory sort of vocabulary to start with, but the rest of us did not, right? And so it was profoundly jarring to be plopped in an all German school and being swarmed by a whole bunch of children that and adults and teachers and everything, and just being swarmed on your first day, just being mobbed. And as a 10-year-old kid, you're like, oh my God, what is happening, right? These people are all swarming around me. And that was profoundly shocking for me. Like, it was just a huge, overwhelming thing for my system. And, that was one of the things that, really stands out to me as a sort of an unpleasant memory, because rather than sort of feeling easeful into a brand new experience, it was actually very, very jarring and not very welcoming at all. Like, it was more, you're swarmed by these people and they're like, who are you, what are you doing here, and those kinds of things, right? And when you're a 10-year-old kid, that's like, you don't really you don't really know how to deal with that, right? And with the way things were at home, it would be one thing to have a very some challenges outside the home, but if you had a structure and a support system within the home, and feeling heard and supported, then perhaps it would not have been as jarring. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case, because within my immediate family, there's my family comes is Polish background, so we there's a lot of unacknowledged trauma in my lineage, as far as what World War II had sort of caused lots of turmoil and rifts and upheaval in people's lives, and a lot of pain and destruction that happened. My grandfather and great uncle were taken to German work camps during the Second World War. On my dad's side and on my mom's side, both her father and his friend were in the Polish resistance, and all of those things. So it was it was an incredibly jarring time. And so unfortunately, both my parents kind of grew up in environments where there was not a lot of sort of emotional attunedness, right? And so grew up with a lot of, especially on my dad's side, some neglect and things, which led to, certain mental health issues and things like that, which have gone completely undiagnosed and untreated over the years. And let's just put it this way: those conditions and the resulting behaviors and things like that had a tremendous ripple effect on all of us, in terms of the choices that were made for the family, so that, just sort of being parentified in a lot of ways, right? Because, you had two parents who were quite wounded, and then being parentified to sort of, kind of take care and learning to become the caretaker for, for both, actually. So there was a lot of sort of really fast growing up for me, so I not only had, that pressure and those obligations put upon me at home, but I also had a lot of struggle and, difficulty on the outside as well. So integration into the classroom and all of those things, it was always sort of like, oh, the foreign kid, oh, the foreign kid. And so, kind of walking around with that scarlet letter, especially during your formative years, when you want nothing more but to fit in and belong, right? So all of those things played into just a profound loneliness.
Yeah, having that scarlet letter and having
Mm-hmm.
that profound loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
where did you find solace?
In my imagination. That's where
How
that
so?
that's where that dissociative place comes in, where you build up an idea of how you want life to be, and you project that, right? And that really, and sort of like, you tell tall tales and, overcompensate with confidence and, and sort of kind of go into flourish and sort of paint your life as something that is, far more than what it really is for you. And now looking back, it was a very, it was a defensive action for me to kind of do that, to sort of give myself some propping where I didn't have it, you know? And, it was a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, I was like, oh, wow, well, she's fun, she's creative, she's got stories and whatnot. But on the flip side, some people were like, pardon my French, oh, she's full of shit, like just, and so that was, that kind of also came with some challenges in the social sphere for me as well, right? It was, it was tough to really discern friendships and authenticity and those kinds of things. Like the concept of authenticity was quite foreign to me at the time, because I also, was mirroring behavior that was modeled to me, right? Where it was sort of all about appearances, right? Where it's like, you know, there's decay on the inside, but, the shiny facade on the outside, we're picture perfect family with all, whatever material trappings we may have had, we didn't lack for that. But I think emotionally, unfortunately, we were quite starved for genuine connection and, yeah, the authenticity piece, right? So, so with all of those things, so that, the imagination was a much needed escape for me at the time. But then, over time, it becomes maladaptive, right? Because you dissociate so much so, and you've externalized and you've been parentified. So you've learned to become a caretaker, so that by the time I was, a young adult and preparing to go off to university, I can, unequivocally state I had no idea who I was, right? And,
How long were you in this state? I would imagine the entire time while you were in Germany,
yes.
and probably even a little bit coming back to the Western world.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yes. No, I, I have to say that my healing journey started about 6 years ago. And so up until that point, and I'm turning 42 this summer. So do the math, Jenny, in terms of how long I was really living in that profoundly kind of, I don't know who I am state, right? Because I was for a very long time living my life the way I thought everyone would expect of me, and not really who I am and who I want to be, right? So, yeah.
Did you have an inkling at that period of time in Germany of moments of where you thought you wanted to go?
Not really yet. I did find sanctuary in the theater. I
Hmm.
started in drama club in my later half of my high school years, and I fell in love. I absolutely adored, the whole stage presence, and, you know, um, just being involved in the theater and all of that. And I had a passion and an affinity for architecture, and theater was just my passion at the time, and skateboarding as well. So I was absolutely dreadful at skateboarding, but I loved it nonetheless. But I decided, then upon graduating from high school, I decided to combine, my interest in architecture and my love of theater, and become a stage designer. So I will never forget, because, well, my dad, he had long been sort of pushing me to go to university in the US, right? Because he's like, oh, there's, so much more opportunity there. Go, go. I didn't really know whether I wanted to or not. But, I wasn't the best student in high school, because I really was very much, I excelled at the subjects that interested me, but I really put in very little attention and interest into the ones that I just didn't gravitate towards. Like I was very just, I was just kind of like, I don't care really, And so my GPA was kind of a bit in the middle because I had straight A's in, the subjects that I loved, but then I would have atrocious grades in the other subjects, right? Which brought my GPA down to like a medium low, right? And so that didn't exactly make things easy for me to have prospects to go to university in Germany, because they have a sort of a ranking system in terms of priority as based on your GPA, right? So I would have had to wait years to be able to pursue studies there. So I knew this, and I was like, okay, so I don't really want to. I knew, I was like, I got to get out of here. I was like, I got to get out of this house, because I'm like, I can't stay here anymore, because I don't want to spend the next few years, trying to live down, being berated about how, my GPA sucked and I couldn't get into, university here and whatever. And, so when I got that letter of acceptance to the City University of New York, I will never forget the feeling of the cold tile in the dining room on the floor. I literally fell to my knees and kissed the floor. I was like, thank God. Um, yeah, I'm not even joking, Denny. I remember feeling it like on my nose and my cheeks, and I was like, I remember feeling the coldness of the tiles, and because I kind of knew, I was like, okay, I'm finally going to be able to be a little freer now. I had no idea what that freedom meant, but yeah,
Just the
because when I went to New
thought of
York,
that freedom.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
the
that's it
thought of that
exactly.
freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of sort of completely expanded things for me, and I was like, oh shit, yeah, like I will finally not have that breathing down my neck all the time. And just sort of the constant critiquing, but that did continue by phone. So, but and the funny thing is that when I arrived in New York after being in in a very sort of pristine southern Bavarian environment, where it's just beautiful, picturesque, rolling hills and gorgeous old architecture and things like that, and then you land in Newark. Enough said. And I take the cab. I could afford about 2 or 3 nights at a hotel before, so I had literally 3 days to find a place to live. And I literally arrived with my backpack, a suitcase, and my letter of acceptance, and that's all I had at the time, right? And but yeah, landing in Newark and taking the cab to the hotel, I'm like driving through like very, very like gritty sort of industrial areas that I to be perfectly frank, I hadn't seen at that point yet, right? And at first I was like, oh wow, like where am I? Is this where I'm going to be? Like, holy cow, like this is, you know, and it was, again, super jarring, like such a culture shock for me, um, but I managed to actually luck out, and I found a basement apartment on Staten Island, just 2 blocks away from the Port Richmond port, like right on the other side of the Kilvancull waterway. So on the other side, you had Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Jersey City, etc. So it was a basement apartment with a big giant metal door and bars on its windows and stuff. But it was home. It was home for the first year,
It
and
was
then
freedom.
yes, it was. It was initially quite exhilarating, but um, that critical voice that that becomes our own, right? When we hear that criticism constantly, then our own inner critic starts to sound that way, right? And so I I was actually unsurprisingly quite pragmatic in the way I approached my studies, because out of fear and survival, and just lack of faith in our ability to follow our dreams. I actually changed my major because I was ridiculed at home. you know, Basically, I wanted to become a stage designer, but I was ridiculed to basically say, oh, okay, you're going to make cardboard cutouts for the rest of your life. Ha ha ha. Right. And that, once again, that just killed all the joy of it, just hearing those things repeatedly, those kinds of things, like never really being taken seriously for the choices that we want to make, the things that are meaningful to us, right? And so, from a very pragmatic perspective, I changed my major because one of my electives was a media theory class. And so I was genuinely interested. I was like, oh, wow, this is really neat. This is really intriguing. And so I changed my major to journalism, because I thought that rather than, sort of starving for my art, because I would hear all the time, like, oh, you're just, you're going to have to like waitress for the rest of your life because you're never going to make a living in the theater, et cetera, and all of those things. Right. And so, yeah.
I find it interesting that you went from one zone where you were designing and creating in a physical manifestation to another area where you're designing and creating, but in an ethereal zone. And what was that inner critic saying in that transition, in that movement from here to here?
The inner critic was saying, at least you can find a copy editing job, a writing job somewhere. At least you'll be able to make a living, And
I find it so interesting, though, that you're going from something that's physical and create something that's tangible and there, and your critic inside is going, you can't make a living out of this, to a zone where you're creating ethereal stuff, intellectual property, and the critic inside was, yeah, this is okay.
Well, that's the thing. It's because that voice is not mine. Because many years later, 21 years later, I am back again creating something physical with my.
So let's get back to New York. So you moved into journalism.
Yes.
What was that like?
Oh, that was awesome. Like, and I landed a job with a community radio station, and and also it was really a very crazy, hectic time. When you're young, you can move mountains, right? I was holding down 3 jobs. So I was working in the radio station, I was working part-time for a PR firm downtown, and I was also working as an English tutor in the English department, right? So as like an essay writing tutor, and plus full-time studies, right? So I still look back and think to myself, how in the hell did I do that then, But I remember I was, after I graduated, I then landed a job with a cosmetics wholesaler, because I minored. I had a double major, right? So I minored in graphic design as well. So I landed like an industrial design job. Also, again, super, intellectual property, very, very kind of boring, because it was a cosmetics wholesaler, right? So I wasn't really working, designing like really overtly creative things. It was really like schematics. So it was like, tubes and bottles and things like that. So, labeling for that and things like that. So it was actually um, quite pragmatic is the word, right? It was just a very matter of fact kind of job. And I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy. Like within a year of doing that, I was like, nope.
What was making
I
you unhappy with it?
Well, because it wasn't feeding that creativity, right? It wasn't feeding that spark, that wanting to do something a little bit outside of the box. Because anytime I brought forward like an interesting, curious idea, then it was scrutinized by management and the client and things like that, and oftentimes ideas were shot down, right? So, and just the commute also. I was still living on Staten Island at the time and working in Midtown, so my commute was quite long, and I just wasn't like, my quality of life was nowhere near where I wanted it to be, and then I just missed being in the academic environment again, because when I was in university, my whole perspective towards learning changed, right? Because I was now studying almost exclusively, and I was able to choose the things that were fascinating to me. Even among my mandatories, you still had some flexibility to at least choose something that was of somewhat interest to me. And so I started to excel in my studies, and I did my undergrad. I graduated summa cum laude, for God's sakes. It was a total 180 for me at that point. Like I became voracious, as a learner. Mm-hmm.
One question I want to ask is, during that period of time, because in Germany it was the lack
Mm-hmm.
of connection that was creating
Yeah.
issues.
Mm-hmm.
How was the connection aspect of your life during that period of time in New York?
Oh, in New York, from an intellectual perspective, and in terms of my friendships and my mentorships with the professors, one of whom is still a dear friend of mine with whom I keep in touch 20 years later, um, and it really changed entirely, because I felt finally seen and heard, you know, that that my ideas and that my perspectives were welcome in the class, as opposed to seen as, oh, that troublemaker, because back in Germany, even early on in fifth and sixth grade, like, we would routinely have, like, the teachers would routinely have class circles where we would discuss our problem child, Natalia, and people would air their grievances and, things like that about, how impossible, it is to have me in the class. And that, it broke my heart, really, you know?
And that discordance that you were feeling from that lack of connection, that
Yeah.
how did you describe it before? The world that you were making up in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Did that disappear at this period of time, or lessen because of that interconnection that you were starting to feel?
That's a very interesting question. I think maybe in the first years in New York, not yet. And later on, perhaps maybe like the first chinks in that armor were starting to show, but not yet, really. Not yet. It really was still very much, because you're still very young and sort of building a persona for yourself, right? So where in Germany I was the skater rebel, right? So I was like the counterculture. I was the one, I was the anarchist. I was the one who, who was kind of the punk who, kind of, oh, screw, screw authority, screw everybody, right? That kind of thing, and with that kind of, sort of that attitude, even though all I was seeking was to be included and recognized by the cool kids, right? And I would tag along, they would tolerate me, but I never really felt like I was welcomed and part of the group, you know. It was here and there I would connect with somebody, but on the whole, not really, you know. I had a handful of friendships, two or three people whom I remember fondly, you know. But it wasn't until, yeah, so in New York, it was a different environment. And yes, that intellectual connection for the first time really started to burgeon, to really develop, to bubble up. But as far as identity, it was still very much a construct because, you became sort of that, that intellectual keener kid, right? Where it's like, your nose is in your books, you're cerebral, you hypothesize, you analyze, you go in. Like, never watch a movie with me because I will it's like I will break it down to say, okay, there's a plot hole here and the mise en scène here sucks or whatever, like I'm like, oh, but I don't really understand what the director is trying to do here or whatever, and it's like, so that's the thing, because like, all of my cinema studies classes and whatnot, all my, sort of the critical analysis and all of that, it's like, never watch a movie with me, done. So because I will tear it apart. Yeah, so
So let's
but
bring it forward to your journalism area.
yeah. Hmm.
And you graduated from
Yes.
university with a journalism degree.
Yes. Yeah.
And then what did you do? Where did you go?
Well, like I said, I took a job working for the industrial design company. That was sort of, I wanted to kind of get my foot in the door somewhere. I needed to kind of pay for myself, right? Because I wasn't getting a lot of support from home because, there was a lot of many months where I was near eviction, where I had no food in the house, because I literally only had a little bit. And when it was where, I don't know, there was something that had to happen where I had to pay for something extra, or when it was right around the start of the semester where I had to pay for textbooks and things like that, those months usually ended up with, me having no food in the house at the end of the month, and really, having to ration and also rely on the generosity of my friends to perhaps buy me a sandwich at the university cafeteria or whatnot, right? So, um, so it was a whole sort of tide change when I was able to kind of go out and find a full-time job, even though it wasn't fulfilling. But it was a full-time job. But because it wasn't fulfilling, I decided no. Academia just kept calling me back, and so because again, that kind of that voracious learning was awakened, and so I decided to go to graduate school, and I wanted to go to NYU. I wanted to go into their media ecology program, and I had the grades for it. I would have been able to get in, but the tuition costs were prohibitive for me because as a Canadian citizen, I wasn't eligible for any American financial aid, like through any of their grants or anything like that. I wasn't eligible for any of that, and I wasn't about to go into several $100,000 dollars of debt just to finish my master's degree, right? And it was just so prohibitive for me to stay there. So I started looking at Canada because I was like, there's no way in hell I'm going back to Europe. My parents were still out there, and I was like, there's no way in hell I'm going back. I have no interest in going back. So I looked at Canada, and I had the choice of either Concordia in Montreal or Ottawa U, and I looked at what the packages that they were offering me in terms of funding and all of those things. And in the end, Ottawa won out, and I moved up here. And so yeah, that's and then unfortunately, my relationship at the time fell apart because my partner at the time was just he couldn't acclimatize here, like he just, I don't know, I guess he just didn't feel that he really wanted to be here and whatnot. So he moved back to New York, and then it really became, a two income household became a one income household. And so I had to take about a year sabbatical from my grad studies to focus on working full time so that I can catch up and once again afford to pay tuition. And then but what ended up happening is I landed some jobs with the government, right? And so I decided to switch to part-time studies. And so, what my plans originally were to complete my master's degree in 2 years actually took me 5 while I was working full-time for the government and taking night classes. And so after that point, after 5 years of me, falling asleep atop my books, and then waking up for another 8-hour day, at that point I was like, okay, yeah, that PhD ain't happening. Because I'm like, I'm not doing this for another 8 years, yeah. So no, but realistically, at that point, I had already started my communications career in the federal government, and so the PhD at that point just really became window dressing because I was like, I had moved away from the idea of becoming a full-time academic, and so I was like, I don't really need it at this point, right? So I just kind of stepped away from that, and it became more and more sort of irrelevant to me. And yeah, and so that brings me to the first time I was at DAPA when we were still Army News.
So before we get to that point, there's some
Mm-hmm.
key points in this story that I'd like to touch upon.
Okay.
When you moved to Canada,
Mm-hmm.
what was that feeling of coming back into the country? What was that sensation? Because I know I could tell from your voice that you'd had a path that you were hoping to do in the States, and now you're having to come back to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
What was that sensation, that feeling like?
Well, it was interesting because when I came back, it was I had to make a trip up here first before we actually moved everything, right? So we took a train up here, and then we rented a rented a car from Toronto and drove up to Ottawa. And it was a Prius. So it was the first, and the funny thing is that I drive a Prius now again, but that was the first time I had experienced, driving a Prius, and it was so quiet, and it was so, it was such a lovely experience driving it, and just sort of the whole kind of, it became almost like, hopeful, just sort of that experience, even though the train yard was ridiculous. The train ride was ridiculously long to get to Toronto. Like, at times the train was going so slowly, I could have gotten outside and ran to Toronto faster, than the train was going at the time, right? And coming from Europe, where I'm used to high speed trains, this was absolutely ridiculous, that it should take 21 hours to get from New York City to Toronto, which it did. And that was absolutely absurd to me. But once we arrived in Toronto and got the rental car and drove up to Ottawa and whatnot, it was like, it felt really, to me at least, because I can't speak for my then boyfriend, but for me it was incredibly hopeful to sort of start something new. Like, I kind of really wanted to sort of just kind of like damn it, I want to start my life again. I want to start something new, because I was like, I needed something, some hope to latch on to. And yeah, so that was kind of how that experience felt to me. There was some hope there. Yeah.
The next part of the journey of schooling and realizing that you weren't going to make the distance. So getting the job with the government.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got, I would imagine, two strong emotions of the desire to get it finished, but the relief of getting a job and having some support and feeling security
Yeah.
in that sense. Describe a little bit about what that was like for you.
Mm. Well, if you that notion of the elusive, very elusive notion of security, right? Because yeah, I'll get to the example that taught me that even the concept of security is just completely is very elusive because at first I was thinking that I need to have the permanent job. I need to have it and need to kind of to feel that sense of safety because for coming from an environment all my life where I had very little stability, very little foundation, very little safety, right? Because of the unpredictability of, the moods of, my father and whatnot, all of those things, and having that very, just that very shaky ground at home, plus super shaky ground on the outside and whatnot. So you kind of latch on to that notion of some kind of bedrock, right? And it was interesting because for the longest time, um, I would shy away from conflict and and things that were difficult, and I would often run away from things. And so there were employment situations where now in hindsight I realized that I was bullied. I was not treated well, but in all cases I backed down and ran, meaning did everything I could to find another job to just get away. Now in hindsight, the me of today would have pursued the union grievance, would have pursued the complaint to management, et cetera, about all of those things. But at the time, I didn't have the confidence to do so. And then sort of, the big kahuna happened where I was like, oh, wow, I landed a job at what I thought was a great situation. That was the first time that I left, national defense. I was working for Army Public Affairs back in 2010, and I left that job and to pursue, what I thought would be a nice sort of stable situation. It was a portfolio agency of Industry Canada and whatnot, and so it was a small council and it's a nice staff and what have you. But unfortunately, what ended up happening is I got laid off. So my idea of, you know, my notion of, security got shattered right there. And so through that, um, unfortunately, what for them, unfortunately, what ended up happening is that I did finally, start to gain a little bit of confidence there because, when they did this, when they kind of sort of reorganized, they did sort of a reorg internally, and there was myself and several other people who were let go, and the thing is that I was confident enough to file a complaint through a lawyer for sort of the way that when I returned from maternity leave, that my job had changed. They had completely reassigned me to a different role, but yet neither my position, my title, my compensation, my KPIs, all of my performance metrics and things like that, nothing was changed. So I was doing like a project manager level job for, a like senior communicator level work, right? But so I was doing far more than what I was compensated for. And per the Canada Labor Code, unfortunately, they're not allowed to do that without making all of those administrative changes and without advising me of it in advance. So that was my loophole where I was able to say, look, you guys need to kind of compensate me for this, right? And so I got a bit of a golden parachute for a little bit, and that was a vindication for me as well, right? Because I finally felt that I stood up for myself, for a situation where things were not 100% above board, right? Things were not handled well on my behalf, right? And so that was a huge lesson for me, and the idea of security being completely elusive, and security doesn't come from the outside. Security comes from within, right? A feeling of stability and what have you. And it took me a long, long time, very, very long, long time to realize that. And yeah, so that situation brought me back to Army Public Affairs, and that's where you and I met and started working together. So,
So
yeah.
one thing you were talking about there is security comes from within.
Yeah.
Where was the moment that you started thinking those thoughts?
When I started deepening my yoga practice and I started more actively incorporating meditation and just doing inner work, like inner child healing, doing, some energetic work, just doing a lot, some therapeutic work. I saw a lot of counselors and things like that. So kind of really, really doing the legwork of dredging up all of the shit, pardon me. But yeah, dredging it all up, working through it, processing it, integrating it, and healing it, right? So it really took a while for me to understand, to not constantly seek, validation or, sort of that sense of stability or that sense of confidence in myself, that validation externally. And to be perfectly honest with you, like I still have moments where I struggle with that, right? But I am far stronger in
Absolutely.
it
Yeah.
today, and I'm quite proud of that.
So we've kind of time skipped a little bit because your yoga practice is still a little ways off from where we left the story. So you and I met in Dapa,
Yeah.
and you were a writer, a creator of many things that was there. Tell
Yeah.
me about your time there.
Oh my God. It was incredible. It was such just the constellation of people that we had there at that time. I was so just in awe of all of you. Like I had such tremendous admiration for all of you, and it was such a delight to work with you all. And like I for the first time in my life, I felt at home. I felt like I was part of a team, that I was included, and that I was, I felt really, really, yeah, just really happy there, and so it was a great experience, even though it was, oh my gosh, like that, the tempo was wicked high. It was, the stakes were, incredibly high as well. It was a high stress, very dynamic job, but yet I felt like I really found a place that made sense for me, right? And I was really good at what I did, damn it, So, and the thing is that, for some, my admiration and my respect for the military community, my love for the community became so pronounced at that point that, I started toying with the idea of joining, and yeah, and it was interesting. I remember speaking to my colleagues and things like that, and I remember hearing, "Are you out of your mind?" Like, like, why would you do that? Are you out of your mind? But I was like, I was dogged. I was determined. I had, because through my studies of trauma and things like that, I had formed a commitment within myself that I wanted to help those who are struggling. And I had not yet at that point figured out how I would go about doing that, but I knew that in order for me to really be able to stand in front of a group of military folk, first responders, veterans, what have you, the only way I could credibly stand in front of them and say, "Hey, I'm here to help," is becoming one with them, becoming part of the community. And so I knew, I was like, all right, I got to serve. So at the young age of 37, I up and joined the military, and so yeah, I was incredibly proud to put on the uniform. But life, once again, has a way to, throw a monkey wrench into things in a lot of ways. Although, on one hand, one could call it a monkey wrench. On the other hand, one could call it a blessing, or a big lesson, as it were, because it really, all of these pieces are so clearly purposeful. Painful though they may have been, but purposeful. So I'm getting to what ended up happening to me is that on training, I ended up fracturing both my legs. And so right off the bat, it's just kind of like, here, welcome to the military. Let's break your legs first. So, yeah. And I ended up in a wheelchair and, for several months, and I was in a very dicey situation because it wasn't, I wasn't even sure I was ever going to be able to walk again without a cane, and my orthopedic surgeon, my doctor, my physio, all of them were like, they're just like, yeah, you might want to sort of hang up your hat on the military thing because, given the injuries that you have, it might not work out. But I was, again, determined. I was like, oh no, you don't. I'm going to recover from this. And I worked incredibly hard, like, recovery PT 8 times a week, physio twice a week, and all of that, and just busted my butt to get out of that wheelchair, to start, incrementally recovering. I started running again and all of those things. And, I recovered enough to get back on training, but again, recovered enough. I was not healed yet. By no stretch of the imagination. I was still in a lot of pain, but you grin through it because you want to get through the training, right? You're just kind of like, I'm fine, even though you're grimacing in pain because, like, you can't do certain things without a lot of pain, right? And so I plowed through it and I made it through the training, got posted back to Ottawa, and was waiting for all of my trainings. I had to do a voluntary occupational transfer because my initial offer was for intelligence officer as opposed to public affairs. So I knew that, I wanted to OT once I was in, and I knew that the process was a bit less involved once you're in. So I initiated that process and got that. Finally, it took over a year, but, so in all of those times, and throughout that whole time, I was still struggling physically. because my injuries were just not healed properly, right? And so there's a lot of additional scar tissue. There was a hell of a lot of inflammation because I was on those broken legs for a long time without even knowing they were broken, right? So, so there was a lot of complication that happened with my condition and things like that. So I was in and out of temporary categories. I was in and out of treatment. I was up and down, just constantly sort of like I'd recover just enough to start training again and like PT and all of that, and then it would start dipping again because the chronic pain and all of that would get to me. And so there were a lot there because of the misalignments that have happened and whatnot. It's created a lot of ancillary injuries and conditions. Like I have several tears in my hip now and whatnot because of all of those, because of all of the compensatory action that your body does when it's trying to protect itself or protect an injured area and whatnot. So there was a whole host of physical complications that came following my injuries, and then
Not only physical,
yeah,
talk a bit about the mental aspect of all of that as well, because I can
oh
only
god,
imagine going from this is what I want to do to I don't know if I can do this anymore.
exactly,
And the
yeah.
dissonance between the two.
It was absolutely excruciating, to kind of face those inner battles, right? And not to mention the fact that it was incredibly traumatic for me to have experienced being again in a very lonely and isolated place because unfortunately my care was not transferred to Ottawa. So I was alone in a big giant building in Saint Jean, away from my baby, away from my family. They would not transfer my care back to Ottawa. They wouldn't let me go home. So I was stuck there in a wheelchair recovering for almost a year. And
Having you describe that, how
yeah,
similar was it to being alone in Germany?
very, very, yeah. And, you know, so once again, it just felt incredibly jarring. And once again, my caretaker, quality kicked in because, I was one of the few older folks there, right? And you had, you're injured and you're in a room full of other injured kids, 18, 19, 20 years old, they're disoriented, they're frustrated, they're scared, they're sad because they also feel like, oh my gosh, their dreams are getting dashed now, you know? It's like you had young guys there with dreams of JTF2, and they've got screws in their legs, and it's like not likely to happen, dear, like that kind of thing. But and so it was I was den mom in a lot of ways as well, right? So I can't even tell you how many kids I had to console, in the women's washroom. I can't even tell you how many girls were, crying on my shoulder, and all of that. So yeah, so not only was it profoundly isolating for me because I didn't have that support system around me, but once again, the caretaking and whatnot was incredibly burdensome as well. So yeah, it was very, very hard. Like, so it was um that betrayal of not being granted the compassion of sending me home to recover. That felt like a profound abandonment again, where it's like I'm not being treated as a human being. I am not being treated as a someone who needs some tenderness, some gentleness, and some compassion in her life. That has been absent quite profoundly in my life, and this was yet another reflection of that experience. So that, yeah, it brought up a lot of those feelings of loneliness and despair in a lot of ways, right? And
So I wonder if, and you can correct me completely, I
mm,
wonder if part of that journey through Germany of understanding that loneliness and being in a similar situation, but seeing other people in the same situation and created that system within you of compassion to say, listen, I didn't have it, but that doesn't mean I can't give it.
absolutely. Yes. Like it was, when I say that, sort of the caretaking was burdensome, it was only in the sense that I yet at that point didn't know how to fill my own cup. But from a heart perspective, I was fiercely protective of those kids, and it was, like you're kind of galvanized in a lot of ways. You're sort of kind of banded together and whatnot, and in this ragtag group of physically broken people, and yeah, so there was absolutely, yes, like that. It so further sharpened that compassion within me, for sure, and it once again reinforced my will and my desire to say, no, I gotta help. Like this, there is no way that I can't do this, right? And so that at that point, I still hadn't figured out how I would do it, how I would help, but I knew I was committed. I was like, I wanted to help. And when I came back to Ottawa, I started toying with the idea of maybe pursuing a clinical psych degree or something something like that. I was like, oh, because, I was so fascinated with the psychological piece about trauma that, I was playing with that idea, but like, it just never sat right. I was just like, don't really want to. But then, it was really interesting how, once again, these serendipitous experiences sometimes happen, where my husband and I, we were at IKEA with our daughter, and we had just stopped at the cafeteria, and we had just had a small bite to eat, and Anna wandered off to the little play station that they have, like these little toy stations in the middle of the cafeteria, right? Um, and it was like this little touch screen where she could do like coloring and stuff like that. And then we saw like another little girl come up to that little play station there. And the two of them immediately hit it off, started chatting and, playing and what have you. And um, and we saw that, there was a couple sitting, a couple of seats further away, and they were observing the two of them as well. And we kind of, surmised that, that was the other little girl's parents. And so, I looked over at the woman, and I kind of smiled and said, isn't it amazing how children just are absolutely just so open and just can, strike up conversation with each other, and just sort of no holds barred, and just are absolutely receptive and whatnot. And she was like, yes, oh my gosh, I wish we could all do that as adults still, right? And so we started chatting, and and she had just finished her Kundalini yoga teacher training, and she was raving about this studio here in town. And and I said to her, I was like, I want to help the military and veteran community, and I want to work with people who are wrestling with trauma. And she was like, oh my gosh, you need to be a yoga teacher. You need to do that. And because we had started chatting about, years of doing yoga and whatnot. She's like, you need to do this. Check out this studio. And I was like, okay, great. I will. And then that's it. And yeah, so I was like, I went to one of the info sessions, and the teacher there, who would be presenting the teacher intensive. It was like a summer intensive, and I just immediately, like, I loved her. I was like, oh my gosh, she's got such a great, such a great presence, a great spirit. She's bubbly and whatnot, and fun. So I was like, okay, great. An engaging learning experience. It's not going to be dry. It's not going to be anything like that. So it's like, wonderful. This is great. So sign me up, and I did it. And it wasn't, it wasn't until that point that I clued in, that I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is what I want to do. And so right after completing my studies, this is now 2 years ago, um, right after completing my studies, I started my business. I started teaching yoga even at Army HQ, in the gym. And yeah, so I started my business, started slowly building my clientele, and I'm now comfortably teaching several private clients. I have 6 studio classes that I teach online now, and yeah, I'm doing quite well. I'm working with. I will likely be teaching yoga for Soldier On this summer, fingers crossed, and also working with some of the first responder organizations here in town, etc. So, there's some prospects for workshops at Algonquin College for the Police Foundations program and things like that. So, I'm also looking forward to doing some work for Camp Aftermath, which is a program that is for veterans who are in the post-traumatic recovery stage, post-traumatic growth stage, and I hope to be, no, I will be teaching with them, but we're hoping that it will happen this year. We're looking at the fall. Given the pandemic circumstances, it's all kind of, up in the air at this point, but yeah, so I'm really looking forward to all of those things. So, this has really sort of opened up that door for me to really find. And the more I go into this field, I'm now completing my advanced studies. I'm just one final report away from finishing my 500-hour certification, and I'm trained in trauma sensitive and accessible practice. So, I really have that specialization to work within this community, so yeah, that's really what brought me here.
I'd like to bring to your attention, and you
Mm-hmm.
probably already know this, so I
Mm-hmm.
am not uh, divulging any secrets, but
Mm-hmm.
the journey that you have taken from then to now, that deep isolation, that hardship, alienation, hard and difficult decisions to follow one path and not another, and the eventual breaking down of your physical self, let alone your mental self.
Mm-hmm.
Each of those hardships has
Mm-hmm.
added a new piece to the puzzle for who you are right now, and the help that you can provide people who have been through such similar circumstances. That understanding and that empathetic connection point, I could only imagine,
Absolutely.
is created stronger through that.
Oh, absolutely. And as I touched upon earlier, that all of these pieces are, have, as painful as they have been entirely purposeful. I realize this now. Like, there are moments where I thought, like, God, why is all of this happening? Like, what kind of an awful person must I have been in a former life, that I'm like, that all of this karma is coming back to bite me in the ass this life, right? But and there's been like dark moments, like that I've I didn't realize just how much I was living with depression and severe anxiety and whatnot, because when, and like really, dark thoughts and all of those things, like I can't even tell you how many times I've, um, you know, really kind of wanted to end it. And, you know, the thing is, I, I realize now that I'm like, no, don't ask those questions anymore, because it all makes sense. Because exactly like you said, I wouldn't be in that place where I can feel myself reflected in others and others reflecting back to me, that profound connection, finally, And yeah, so there's that. I finally feel, that groundedness, not feeling like I'm a leaf in the wind anymore, because for a very, very long time, if you perhaps remember, the beginning and end of Forrest Gump with the feather, that always, so profoundly, like, just hit home for me. Like I would routinely, like, even at the start of the movie, when that feather first flies, and then at the end of it, of course, everybody cried at the end, but at the start, I would well up going, oh my God, and because it just hit home so much that for a very long period of time in my life, I felt exactly like that I was a feather, a leaf in the wind. And I felt that life was happening to me as opposed to me making my life happen, right? And now I, you know, I have all of these experiences, and especially I won't ever deny that, you know, the experience of becoming a military member, becoming a soldier, is an intensely proud experience for me. It's a title that I paid my dues to earn, and I will always wear it proudly. So yeah, it gave me, like, it gave me a depth of confidence that I didn't have before. And so even though my service was relatively brief, because once again, not only my injuries, but, family circumstances, and my daughter just, needing a little bit of extra care in her life, and me deciding to go full mama bear, to say I need to, withdraw from a full-time job to spend more time caring for my little one. That kind of cut my career shorter than I had anticipated. But you know what? It all ultimately is a divine timing of sorts, right? Because I feel now, in retrospect, that it was time. It was time for me, that I had kind of gleaned from the experience what I needed to learn, and what I needed to experience, what I needed to feel through through true felt experience, right? And I needed to do that, but that my purpose ultimately is not necessarily to remain in the uniform, right? But to use those experiences that shaped me while I was in uniform, to sort of forge that relatability, forge that trust, forge that, moving on into coming into my own as an entrepreneur. Because again, it's that confidence. It was scary as hell for me to say, I am, for the first time in my life, voluntarily stepping away from a well-paying full-time, like full-time job, kind of stable, had that, whatever stability means at this point. But do you know what I mean? Like, it was a huge step for me to do that. And again, if I didn't have, the confidence to take that step, this would have been immensely, it was scary, but not as scary as it would have been if I hadn't grown to the person that I am now. If, let's say, 10 years ago, I don't know if if I would have had the confidence to actually do that, right? And so now I am, very, very happily and proudly ensconced in my, in my work as a yoga teacher, as a meditation coach, and so yeah, I'm I'm immensely I'm immensely grateful to be where I am right now.
I want to thank you so much for your story here, Natalia. The journey you have taken has been a difficult one and a long road, and it's still got a ways to go yet.
Oh
But
yes, I
I
got big
am,
plans, Danny. I got big plans.
and I can't wait to see them. So I'd like you to be able to share where people can find who you are and where they can get a hold of you if they would like to connect with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can find my website at www.nbfwellness.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Natalia Flynn Yoga. And you can follow me on Instagram at NBF_wellness. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there as Natalia Baginski Flynn. So wherever it is that you'd like, I also have a YouTube channel, Yoga and Wellness with Natalia. So feel free to reach out. You can also reach me just plain via email if that's your jam, nbfwellness@gmail.com.